Today at the National Press Club, Australian National University Chancellor and former Foreign Affairs Minister Julie Bishop. For today's Australia and the World annual lecture, she will discuss implications of megatrends for Australia and how that could bring fundamental change to our daily lives. Julie Bishop, today at the National Press Club.
Well, good afternoon, and it's great to see so many people here today. Welcome to the Australian National University's 6th Annual Australia and the World Lecture. My name is Mark Kenny, and I'm delighted to be here at my old haunt, the National Press Club. And can I start by acknowledging this land on which we meet, the ancestral home through millennia of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and pay my respects to their community leaders and especially their elders. Can I also acknowledge many representatives of foreign governments here today, as well as the Chief Executive of the National Press Club, Maurice Riley, and thank the board, fellow academics from the ANU, particularly Professors Paul Pickering, Shirley Leach, this is a few that I've seen around, Shirley Leach, Bronwyn Parry, Matt Gray, Frank Bongiorno, Dr Beatrice Bijon, and my wonderful colleagues at the Australian Studies Institute, Fiona Preston and Angie Ghirardello. It is now my distinct pleasure to invite the Vice-Chancellor of ANU, Professor Brian Schmidt, AC, to introduce the 2023 lecture. Professor Schmidt, as you will know, is a Nobel Prize winner, he's a winemaker, and he's been a great supporter of Australian studies at the ANU, and of course, he's not long from ending his term as VC. Professor Brian Schmidt.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you for your acknowledgement to country. I too pay my respects to elders past and present. So, good afternoon, everyone, today, and welcome to the 2023 Australia in the World annual lecture, and it's great to be here with you today at the National Press Club. Now, this lecture has become one of the university's premier annual public addresses. The lecture is an opportunity to enrich our understanding of our nation, its progress, and its place within a national and international context. Today's address aims to provoke a national conversation about Australia's place in the world and promote the Australian National University as the leading international hub for Australian studies. It is my pleasure today, therefore, to introduce our ANU Chancellor, the Honourable Julie Bishop, to deliver Megatrends in a Rapidly Changing Global Environment 2023, the ANU Australia and the World Annual Lecture. Now, Julie has a long CV, but well known to me as Minister of Education, the first female Minister for Foreign Affairs, the first female Chancellor of the ANU, and therefore my boss, and she was appointed most recently the 2021 Kissinger Fellow. With that, Julie, over to you.
Thank you to Brian Schmidt, our brilliant Vice-Chancellor. And I'm delighted to be here today at the National Press Club, albeit not as a politician, but as the Chancellor of the Australian National University, to deliver the 6th Annual Australia in the World address of the Australian Studies Institute at ANU. And I thank Professor Mark Kenny for the invitation, and I'm delighted to see him in a different role. Much more collaborative, far less adversarial. So I too acknowledge and celebrate that we meet on the traditional lands of the Ngambri Ngunnawal people and pay my respects to elders past and present. Along with the Vice-Chancellor, I acknowledge the presence of so many members of the ANU faculty. I acknowledge the distinguished ambassadors and members of the Diplomatic Corps and the invited guests of the National Press Club and friends of ANU. Well, given that I had 20 years in the National Parliament, 11 as the Deputy Leader of my party, 9 as a Minister, including 5 as Foreign Minister, and given my public and private sector roles now, I have continued my deep interest in foreign policy and Australia's place in the world. In fact, it was that passion that drove me into politics in the first place. Today I'm going to discuss a number of megatrends that are driving rapid and disruptive change and that will impact most certainly on Australia, our Indo-Pacific region and the globe. A megatrend is a major movement or pattern that emerges in a macro and environment, and megatrends, like beauty, are very much in the eye of the beholder, for there's no universal agreement about what should be classified as a mega trend. There are some think tanks that list about 12 currently, CSIRO, and I note Dr. Larry Marshall, who's formerly of CSIRO, is here. A report last year, Our Future World, listed 7 megatrends. Well, I'm going to list 4. And they are, in no particular order, technological advancement, the shifting relative power in a geostrategic and military sense, the backlash against globalisation and climate change. There are, of course, more: health, demography, urbanisation, energy consumption, but I think 4 will do us for today. The first, the technology revolution, or the 4th industrial revolution, has already had a profound impact on how we live, how we work, how we engage, how we connect. And much of the disruptive change is actually driven by the ubiquitous small personal computer. It was only January 2007 when the first smartphone, the Apple iPhone, was released, yet it's come to dominate our lives. It's estimated that there are 7 billion smartphones around the world, which would represent about 85% of global population, but obviously the use is far more concentrated. There are something like 3.8 million apps on the Google Play Store and another 1.6 million on the Apple App Store. So technology is dominating our lives. Now, who would have thought prior to COVID that you could hold an international video conference in real time with multiple participants from around the world using your mobile phone? I mean, prior to 2007, it would have seemed science fiction, but today it's just the norm. Now, while the technologies that we have already experienced have had a profound disruptive effect, our experts tell us that the most disruptive are yet to come. The most disruptive technologies are still ahead of us, whether it be through AI or quantum computing or genetic engineering and the like. Now, ChatGPT, the AI chatbot, has already spooked many communities around the world and has certainly shaken up many industries. In fact, Google itself cited it as a red flag, for it would have the potential to challenge its dominance in internet searching and advertising. Is ChatGPT the driver of the next wave of change? Well, I thought I'd go to the source. So I went to ChatGPT and said, tell me all about yourself. Is AI the next driver of change? Back it came within seconds with a very impressive list of its strengths. It mentioned automating otherwise mundane tasks. It talked about its ability to perhaps disrupt traditional jobs but create new jobs. It spoke about its ability to drive decision-making based on an analysis of vast amounts of information that no human could possibly achieve. It talked about its ability to find new diagnoses and treatments in the health sector. new drugs, and it talked about personalising of services and recommendations. I thought, well, that's all very good. What's the bad news? It came back, well, there is the issue of ethics and bias and accountability and the potential for misuse, and of course privacy and security could be exploited by malign actors. It could in fact entrench the societal inequities, and it could of course damage, through the scale of the economic transformation, entire communities, industries and countries. Okay. As a matter of fact, the co-founder of OpenAI, which established ChatGPT, has warned that superintelligence could in fact be the most impactful technology ever. And he warned that in the wrong hands, it could be dangerous. In fact, he went so far as to say that superintelligence, by its vast power, could disempower humanity. He even said it could be a threat to humanity. So I went back to ChatGPT and said, well, this is what your boss said. What do you think? It came back and said, while we acknowledge that there are such concerns, there is no reason to believe that AI will inevitably lead to a threat to humanity, but that it could solve some significant problems, that through reasonable development and proper regulation and collaboration between academics and policymakers and society at large, AI could be a huge benefit for humanity. Well, that was all very well and good, but it spoke about regulation. So how does one regulate the AI sector? In 2021, I was appointed for a 12-month period to an AI policy forum at MIT, the Schwarzman School of Computing. And this brought together, as other universities have done, brought together academics and tech sector personnel and government members to talk about how we would create a global framework to regulate the use and the development of artificial intelligence. We talked about the ethics endlessly. We talked about how to get competing nations on the same page. We wondered about how we would get the military and security sectors covered by such a framework. And we didn't come up with any answers. At ANU, we are playing our role. For the first time in over 40 years, we've set up a new school, the School of Cybernetics, which is being led by a very distinguished professor in Dr. Genevieve Bell. And this is situated within our now called College of Engineering, Computing and Cybernetics. And cybernetics is the intersection between society and disruptive technologies. And I'm told that the debates about AI reflect the 1940s and 1950s debates in the early days of computing, where we're worrying about the automation of tasks requiring logical processes and replicating the human cognitive behaviours. But in actual fact, we can do more to regulate AI. I believe that we should embrace AI. It's here to stay. And I'm often asked as Chancellor, well, what is ANU going to do about students who just type in a request of ChatGPT and back comes their assignment? Well, our brilliant Vice-Chancellor gave the best response I've heard in a long time, and he said, you would use it to get a better outcome. There's no point in resisting it. You harness it. And why not set an assignment for students that requires them to go to ChatGPT for an answer and then use that answer for a much better, more creative, more original response. Now, I thought about that, and I remember back in the day when I was doing law school exams that one year they allowed us to bring in books, open book. You could take anything you liked into the exam, anything you wanted. You could read it, but you then had to create your own work, an original, creative answer. So to me, it sounds very similar. In fact, my thinking was backed up recently at an Australia-Canada Economic Leadership Forum, AUSCAN, that I co-chaired in Toronto. In fact, it was only last week. Time flies. And we had a session on cyber and AI. And Australia was represented by Stella Solar, who is the head of CSIRO's AI Centre. And Stella said, AI is not doing anything new. What it's doing is what we've always done, but way differently, in ways we've never thought of it, and on an unprecedented scale. She did speak about the plethora of standards and guidelines and governance capacities that are emerging from all over, from every sector. Somebody's got an idea on how we're going to regulate AI. And so her centre at CSIRO is now more of a curator of all these standards and guidelines and governance ideas that are coming in to clarify and simplify world's best practice. And in that regard, she believes that CSIRO will be providing an enormous benefit, an asset, a resource for businesses in particular where there are huge knowledge gaps. And in that regard, I think that CSIRO will make a significant contribution to this debate about how we get a global charter. It's interesting, last week, President Biden brought together the 7 major AI players, got them in one room and set about getting some agreed commitments, some specific commitments. Now, they were rather unspecified, as you can imagine, but he was recognising the fact that it's the tech sector that has the expertise. It's the tech sector that knows how AI is going to develop. And it's the tech sector with the money. So government regulation tends to be cumbersome and slow. And given the rapidly changing nature of AI, governments will never be able to keep up with the disruption. So the Biden administration has brought the tech sector in to say, you've got to be part of this governance approach. And I believe that that's where Australia has a significant role to play through CSIRO, through our School of Cybernetics and others, to help shape the environment, to help shape the governance rules that will hopefully assist us in providing guardrails around this most exciting but most challenging technological disruption. And I believe that it's time the United Nations stood up and called a multi-stakeholder meeting, a forum, to tackle this issue, because it's going to be very difficult to get competing nations aligned on this issue, but perhaps something like the IPCC climate change forums. I think the UN could do that. So let me turn to my second megatrend, and that is the relative shifts in geopolitical, geostrategic and economic power. First, the increasing rivalry between the United States and China, and secondly, the challenge by some nations to the rules-based order. I recall back in 2017 releasing a white paper on foreign policy in which we predicted that the following decade would see a much more contested, much more competitive world, and that rules and norms would be challenged in ways we'd not seen for about 70 years, and that there would be some who would directly challenge the rules-based international order and certainly put it to the test. Now, the rules-based international order is that network of conventions and institutions and protocols underpinned by international law that has evolved since the Second World War, specifically designed to guide the behaviour of nations and towards each other to avoid a repeat of the catastrophic global conflicts of the 20th century. And to that extent, it has worked. It was also designed to ensure that all nations had an opportunity to grow and prosper, and that it would assist nations to be prosperous and secure. To that extent, it's worked in that we have seen the greatest expansion of prosperity in human history. Hundreds and millions of people have been lifted out of poverty. But all that could be at risk with the growing tensions between the globe's two largest economies and military powers. It was back in 2019 that the Secretary-General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, warned of the Great Fracture, a world where the two largest economies would split the globe in two, where there would be two different and competing worlds, each with their own dominant currency, their own trade and financial rules, each with their own internet and AI capacities, each with their own zero-sum, just geostrategic and military strategies. And to some extent, he's also correct, for we have seen the trade tensions grow between the United States and China, particularly in the technology sector. And the United States and others, including Australia, have invoked national security provisions to ban some Chinese vendors from taking part in our communication systems. The United States is seeking to restrain China from developing a high-end semiconductor industry. And China has announced recently that there will be constraints on the export of key minerals to the United States. Now, it's worth looking at what each of the protagonists is saying about the other. In the 2022 US National Security Statement, the United States claims that China is the only competitor that has the intent to reshape the rules-based international order, and that it's the only competitor with the economic, technological, diplomatic and military power to do so. The US believes that Beijing intends to be the sphere of influence in the Indo-Pacific and be a world power, but that it will use its economic power to coerce nations into supporting it. China, on the other hand, in its national defence policy, says that China is committed to peaceful collaboration with all nations of the world, that it will continue to create the environment for peace, both within China and externally, and that it will abide by the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. China also says that it has no intention to threaten any other nation, however it might develop, and that it will most certainly be peaceful in its development. However, on Taiwan, the policy says that China recognises the absolute need for reunification, and that it warns that it will make no promises as to the use of force, nor will it make any promises about using what it believes to be all necessary measures to achieve reunification. Well, that puts a number of countries, including Australia, in an exquisite dilemma. for the first time in our history, our major trading partner is not also a major defence and strategic ally. In fact, our major trading partner is in open economic conflict with our major defence and strategic ally. But the difference for Australia is that we're one of the few countries in the world with a massive trade surplus with China. And yes, we have felt the brunt of China's displeasure when our world views do not align. Our relationship with the United States is long-standing, and it is deepening, particularly with the establishment of AUKUS. And we don't always agree with the United States, particularly on trade issues and trade policy, but we do manage our differences. In the past, Australian governments have rejected the notion that they need to choose between the United States and China as our major international partner. But increasingly, both the United States and China are forcing a choice. And how this rivalry plays out is going to be of immense importance to Australia, to the Indo-Pacific, and to the globe. Taiwan is an ever-present issue, and I believe that Australia has a role to play with other like-minded nations as a moderator, as a facilitator of continued discussions, and that we, like-minded nations, can help ensure that Taiwan does not become part of a ladder of escalation with military conflict over Taiwan as the last step on that ladder. And in fact, whenever there is an escalation of tensions between the US and China, it's in all our interests to ensure that there's a corresponding de-escalation. Within this megatrend, there is also the issue of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, not of and in itself a megatrend, but it depends whether other aggressors follow the example of challenging the rules-based order, in which case it would become a megatrend. When Russian regular forces crossed the border into Ukraine in February of 2022, it marked the beginning of an official but illegal invasion of Ukraine. For the unofficial invasion began in 2014 when Russia annexed Crimea and when so-called Russian-backed separatists in eastern Ukraine began a civil war against the Ukrainian government. Now, we in Australia know that was a big lie, for on the 17th of July 2014, a Russian surface-to-air Buk missile operated by Russian military inside Ukraine shot down Malaysian Airlines MH17, a commercial flight on its way via Kuala Lumpur to Australia, killing all 298 people on board, including 38 Australians. Australia still holds Russia responsible for that heinous crime. Russia's attempts now to redraw national boundaries through the use of force is an utter betrayal of its responsibilities as a member of the United Nations Security Council. It is a permanent member of the P5 that was designed with a mandate to uphold international peace and security. It is also a direct challenge to the rules-based order, for Russia's actions in trashing the sovereignty of Ukraine go directly against the fundamentals of that rules-based order that we should all be seeking to defend and uphold. And the fact that Russia is on the Security Council with a veto power means that it can forever shield itself from mandated international sanctions. Now, the United States and the EU and Australia and others have imposed autonomous sanctions on Russia. That represents about 45% of global GDP. But there are many nations who have not and who continue to trade with Russia without interruption. What this means is that Russia can continue, that others could follow. And what I find deeply alarming is that there seems to be no interest or progress in a ceasefire that would be a first step to ending these hostilities. In fact, what concerns me is that others will follow suit. And let's appeal to the United States and to China to collaborate as forces for global good in seeking to use their influence, respectively, on Ukraine and on Russia to end this and to work out a solution on how to rebuild a shattered Ukraine. For it's going to take something similar to the Marshall Plan of post-World War II. The Europeans will have to be involved and others. And whether this becomes a megatrend will depend on whether other nations will learn the lessons of this disastrous campaign. Now, my third megatrend is the backlash against globalisation and the forces of globalism, where many feel that they've been left behind, that they haven't benefited from an integrated global economy. I returned from London yesterday, as it turns out, and it was interesting to see that the Brexit decision is still having a major impact in the United Kingdom between the haves and the have-nots. And it was played out in a couple of by-elections where the Tories lost two previously strong seats and just held on to Boris Johnson's safe seat. In fact, the UK Institute of Fiscal Studies reported recently that while the United Kingdom is not the only developed country to have significant inequality in income, it is the country that has seen the inequality in incomes deepen over the last 60 years faster than most other OECD nations. And I think you can put Brexit in the same context as the appeal of President Trump, for he most certainly appealed to those who felt that they'd been left behind, that they hadn't benefited, that elites had benefited, but they hadn't from a globally integrated economy. Indeed, there are communities across the United States who feel angry about the advent of technology and automation that has taken their jobs, and that it was Silicon Valley that has caused them, fellow Americans, to miss out on opportunities. And President Trump most certainly played on that sense of grievance. And it will continue as inequality expands across nations around the world. Another plug for ANU, Professor Anthea Roberts has co-authored a brilliant book, The Six Faces of Globalisation: Who Wins, Who Loses, Why Does It Matter? But you know, it's not just the Trump administration, to be fair. Last year, the United States introduced the Inflation Reduction Act, which, quite frankly, is rather ironic, given that they don't expect it to reduce inflation ever, let alone any time soon. But that Act has many incentives to onshore manufacturing, to bring back home the manufacturing jobs. Now, it's interesting that this sense of grievance has received support from a rather surprising source. The Nobel Prize-winning economist Paul Krugman wrote an essay entitled "What Economists, Including Me," as in Krugman, not me, "what economists, including me, got wrong about globalisation." And he admitted that economists underestimated the impact of the transfer of manufacturing from the United States to China. In fact, Krugman identified with that sense of grievance, that people have missed out on better paying jobs at all, because economists underestimated the scale of the international transfer of manufacturing to China. And he called it hyper-globalisation, his term for this massive transfer to China. Well, that was 2019. Interestingly, I think China now faces its own challenges for its economic model. The authoritarian model has worked well when it was a low-cost, export-oriented economic model. But there are now other countries that are lower cost, and China must face the transition to a higher cost, services-oriented consumer model, and that will not be easy. Democracies around the world must rely on winning the hearts and minds of their constituents in order to retain power. And you can have popular policies to win government, but when it moves into populism, you know you're in trouble. And we have seen populist leaders and economic nationalism rising in countries around the world. And hearing about migration policies and trade policies and tariffs that are all very popular in the short term, but are disastrous in the long term. And we know, for history has proven that to be the case. So I certainly urge governments to address issues of disadvantage and disparity and inequality, but don't embrace the economic nationalism that is absolutely contrary to the forces that drove globalisation in the first place: efficiencies, economies of scale and competitive advantage. Now, Australia has the policy smarts to provide support and guidance to countries around the world on addressing inequality. And I think one of the most brilliant examples is the student loan scheme. And yes, it was ANU Professor Bruce Chapman who in 1989 came up with what was called HECS. We then had a policy, when implemented, that would provide greater access and equality to higher education than we'd ever seen before. And it's recognised around the world as a brilliant piece of public policy. I can tell you this because last week I attended the Association of Commonwealth Universities Forum in Toronto, and a number of Commonwealth nations spoke about our student loan scheme as an example of how to get more students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds access to universities, and I was very proud of that. As an aside, I should say it was rather unfortunate timing to be addressing a group of Commonwealth University Vice-Chancellors, for it was the very day that Premier Andrews announced that Melbourne couldn't afford to stage a sporting contest. And it was doubly unfortunate because the Commonwealth Association of Universities informed me that they had planned their next Commonwealth meeting for Melbourne for 2026, and that they had arranged a summer school for students across the Commonwealth to be in Melbourne to coincide with the Commonwealth Games. So the disenchantment continues. Anyway, my fourth megatrend is that of climate change, the action and reaction to this phenomenon. And Australia...
Luckily, this one's a quick one.
Yeah, this is really quick. Australia, of course, has all the challenges of natural disasters and climate-related, but it also is a country that has relied on plentiful supplies of baseload power driven by fossil fuels. ANU, again, has responded. We know there are no easy answers, but we've set up an Institute of Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions. As a university, we've committed to below zero in all that we do on campus, waste, energy and the like. And we have nature-based solutions and the use of cyber and AI. And our Professor Mark Howden, himself a member of the IPCC, says we have the tools, we just need the political will and the urgency to achieve it. Now, Australia, through its government, could play a significant role by getting a bipartisan climate change energy policy. And I say that with all the optimism of someone who went through the climate wars in Parliament and who watched the demise of the National Energy Guarantee, which in fact had the potential to be bipartisan. But of course we need global commitment, global enforcement. And I say that with all the optimism of someone who attended 3 climate change conferences in Lima, Paris and Marrakesh. So I know how difficult it can be. But in summary, Australia can play a significant role in addressing all of the megatrends that I've mentioned and more. And we have a national resource to assist us provide the evidence base that will be required, and it's the Australian National University. We are the first and only national university, established in 1946 in a spirit of post-war optimism, a research-based institution that was mandated to come up with solutions to the challenges and problems that Australia would face in the future. And in fulfilling our mandate of focusing on national identity and who we are as a country, I believe ANU has fulfilled that, because over the last 77 years we have trained some of Australia's finest. We have educated our best and brightest, and we've come up with solutions through our research that have met some of the world's problems. So connecting talented people and educating them with the skills that will be needed, as ANU has done, was a brilliant idea in 1946. It is now an absolute imperative for our future.
Thank you, Julie. That was a tour de force, bringing together of a whole lot of issues, masterfully done, and a lot of meat there that we can tease out. I'll probably leave it to one or two of the journalists to ask you a question, for instance, in regard to how Australia could develop a bipartisan climate policy, given how hard that has been. It's a pretty thorny one, that one, at least in Australia's political context. I'll just begin, though, by asking you to expand on 2 quick things, or at least to quickly expand on them. They're not quick issues in themselves. You talked about Australia potentially playing a role as a kind of an interlocutor or facilitator of dialogue to manage the Taiwan question. I think that's it's a fascinating idea, and so if you could just perhaps expand on that a little bit. And also just on the rules-based order, it's always been a fairly flexibly interpreted doctrine. Within it, we saw the concept of spheres of influence, and we saw that Russia was allowed to move on Czechoslovakia and Hungary, and America was able to do things, Vietnam, for example. So is China within its, is it reasonable, I suppose, from China's perspective, as it emerges in this new period in the 21st century, for it to be looking for a reinterpretation of that rules-based order, or at least for the strategic space that those other powers have had through the 20th century?
Let me take the Taiwan question first, and I don't overestimate Australia's role in such a vexed issue. But I was reassured, if you like, from comments of Prime Minister Trudeau and others in my recent overseas trips, that they do look to Australia to call it as it is. They do look to Australia to be a voice of reason. And I'm not suggesting that we will have significant influence over China, although I'd like to think they would listen to our view. But I think we do have influence with the United States. That was certainly my experience. And I believe that with like-minded countries who will be directly impacted, the entire globe will be, but take Japan, South Korea, Australia and others, we can point out the blindingly obvious, and that is military conflict over Taiwan would be catastrophic for the globe. And I don't believe that Australia should just accept, oh, well, we're a middle power, they won't listen to us. I believe that we have a role to play and that there is an expectation that we would. On the rules-based order, it reminds me that we missed an opportunity in 1989 when the wall came down, for the USSR held that permanent 5 seat with the veto power. This Federation of Russia just took that seat. What a missed opportunity that was. I would have given that P5 seat to India or Japan or Brazil, in fact, any nation that respected the rule of law. But there you go. Perhaps Doc Everett was right. There shouldn't have been a veto power in the P5 in the first place. The rules-based order does evolve. It is flexible. Institutions do change. But it is the basis of the relative peace we've seen over the last 70 years. I say relative because I'm comparing it with a global conflict. We've not had a third world war, and we've seen this massive uplift in prosperity. So if the rules-based order didn't exist, we'd have to create it. It's not perfect by any means, and reform of the UN is long overdue. But China and other nations who feel that they're not having their voice heard at present have all benefited from that rules-based order. China, perhaps more than any other nation, has become more prosperous, while the US has been the defender and the guarantor of that order. What I believe is necessary is for nations to continue to support the order, but advocate for the change that they think would be in the interests of the majority of nations around the world. And I would urge China, instead of seeking to reshape the rules-based order in its image, to work with other countries to ensure that the rules-based order, for there must be a set of rules, otherwise the Russia example becomes the norm, there must be a set of rules to which most countries, most nations can adhere.
Thank you. A question from Katina Curtis from the West Australian.
Yes, Katina Curtis with the Canberra Bureau here for the West Australian, your local paper.
I am so pleased that the West Australian has a Canberra Bureau still. Just putting it out there.
With your experience and talking to people around the world, what do you think the impact on Australia's international reputation will be from the Voice referendum, whatever the outcome of that is? And what's your message to Liberal voters thinking about how they should vote in this referendum?
I hate to break the news, but whatever's happening in Australia doesn't always make headlines, let alone page 7 of international news. But countries that share our First Nations issues are certainly identifying with the process that we're going through and are certainly following it. For example, I mentioned I've been in Canada. We actually had a session on Indigenous economic development during the Australia-Canada Leadership Forum, and there was significant interest in how Australia was dealing with this issue of the voice and the referendum, because Canada's been there. They don't understand why we're so far behind. It was suggested we're about 40 years behind public policy in this space from Canada. Professor Peter Yu from ANU represented, and Ken White represented Australia on this panel. And the Canadians don't do referenda. They're kind of not into national referenda. They've had about 2 in their entire history. So they were fascinated by that. The consequences of a no vote were not canvassed, I think, by those present because they didn't want to think about the consequences. From my perspective, I chair two significant organisations. First, I'm Chancellor of the Australian National University, and the individual members of our council have endorsed our academic board's support of the voice and a yes vote for the referendum. So each one of our council members endorsed that position. I also chair the Telethon Kids Institute in Western Australia, and we have a heavy focus on Indigenous health and wellbeing for children. And the individual board members of the Telethon Kids Institute have also backed a yes vote and the referendum. So, personally, my message to anyone who wants to listen to what I have to say is that I believe that it is a step in the right direction. I sat through too many of those closing the gap speeches in Parliament to sense that what we were doing was working to close the disparity and the inequality between Indigenous and non-Indigenous populations. In some instances, the key measures were getting worse, not better. So it's not a question of money, it's not a question of politicians coming up with policies, it's a question of giving Indigenous people the franchise to make decisions, to implement policies that will work. We've got to give it a chance.
Daniel Hurst from The Guardian.
Daniel Hurst from Guardian Australia. On the same topic, given you were Deputy Liberal Leader for 11 years, are you disappointed that the party under Peter Dutton is actively campaigning for no? And Liberal Party supporters will have heard the party saying this is risky, it's divisive, it's Orwellian, will re-racialise Australia. Are you disappointed by that sort of rhetoric, and what message of reassurance would you offer to Liberal Party supporters about their ability to support this?
Daniel, the complexity of this matter is exacerbated by the fact that there is not agreement within Indigenous communities, and I'm well aware that there are two leading Indigenous leaders on opposite sides of the case. So you have Noel Pearson, Warren Mundine. I think that confuses people. And the challenge for this referendum, and I needn't spell it out to this room because you all understand, is that the more complex the issue, the less bipartisan it is, the less likely it is to succeed. We've had something like 44 referenda in this country, only 8 have succeeded. I believe all 8 had bipartisan support. They were kind of no-brainers, like giving Indigenous people the vote. And so the more complex it is and the less bipartisan it is, the less likely it is to meet that very high standard of a majority of votes in a majority of states. We've even had referenda that have won the yes vote but have lost on the majority of states benchmark. So I don't express emotions these days about what goes on in politics. I'm not excited, I'm not disappointed. I'm pragmatic about the choices that political parties take. My position as private citizen Julie Bishop and as Chancellor Bishop and Chairman is to support the yes case, for I believe that many Indigenous people, whom I respect greatly, have put a lot of thought into this, and they believe that it is a step in the right direction. No one's claiming that it's going to end inequality and disparity, but surely we have to try something that comes from Indigenous people themselves.
Will private citizen Julie Bishop actively be campaigning out there for yes?
I thought private citizen Julie Bishop, why do I have to talk about myself in the third person? I have just said to the National Press Club my position. That's about as public as I get these days.
Andrew Tillett from the Financial Review.
Thanks, Mark. Ms Bishop, thank you for appearing today. We've seen overnight that Wang Yi has come back as the Chinese Foreign Minister, someone that you dealt with when you were Foreign Minister. I was just wondering if you've got any thoughts about that, that might mean for our relationship, the stabilisation with China, having someone back that's familiar perhaps to the Australian apparatus. And a cheeky follow-on, there's been rumours that you might be appointed the ambassador to France. Has it been canvassed with you? Is it something that you're interested in?
You know I don't speak French. As for your first question, the circumstances of Minister Wang Yi reassuming the position of Foreign Minister are obviously difficult to understand, and I'm in no position to add to that. I'm assuming that the Chinese ambassador is doorstopped about such issues. But I know Wang Yi well. I dealt with him on numerous occasions over 5 years. He is a highly competent, highly professional diplomat. He has an unceasing ability to promote China's national interests. He knows Australia well, and I always had very professional dealings with him, although there is one occasion, but we won't go into that. And we don't have time. Save that one for the book. There isn't going to be one, but save it for the book. And yet, on a personal level, we got along exceedingly well. And I think that it augurs well for Australia. I know the Albanese government is seeking to thaw the somewhat frozen diplomatic relations, and progress is being made. There's still a way to go, it's fair to say, but I think with Minister Wang Yi, at least we have a minister who knows us well and understands the challenges that Australia faces in working with China, where we disagree on some global issues, but where we have significant reason to collaborate on trade, on students, on tourism. There are a whole range of areas where Australia and China have much in common and much to collaborate over.
Thank you.
Melissa Code from the Mandarin.
Hello, Melissa Code from the Mandarin. You've been Foreign Minister and Chancellor and Chair, but it would be remiss of us not to mention that you also had a Barbie made of you. That's timely, because that is also a megatrend. So if I could get you to reflect on...
Barbie's now a megatrend.
If I could get you to reflect on being a woman in politics in light of two things. So firstly, the World Economic Forum have announced this year Australia's improved its gender gap rankings. We've gone from 43rd to 26th, and that index was introduced at 2016 when you were a rising star in federal politics. What are your reflections on the future of women in politics in Australia? And then secondly, cabinet processes and decision-making. Robo-debt... Cabinet,
yeah.
Yes. Robo-debt brought to light the importance of public servants giving frank and fearless advice to cabinet ministers, and what happened in that cabinet process was obviously very important. And the reason I'd love you to speak to this is it goes to the heart of this question of disenfranchisement that you talked about when you spoke to issues of globalisation, because robo-debt obviously does nothing for the enfranchisement of some vulnerable citizens. So could you reflect on the robustness of cabinet processes during your time in politics, and how your relationship with public servants helped you make good decisions in the foreign policy space?
There's a lot in this question. First on Barbie. Now, my Barbie doll was in fact Foreign Minister Barbie, so it just goes to show that Barbie can be anything, including Foreign Minister.
Substance and style.
And I got a real kick out of that. No, I haven't seen the movie, in case you were wondering, but maybe I will after Oppenheimer and after Mission Impossible. And on the question of the cabinet processes, I always found that our public service was open to being questioned, to being probed. I had very competent advisors, including my former Chief of Staff, Murray Hanson, who's so delighted that I've just pointed him out, one of the backroom advisors. But I had advisors who would test and probe and challenge the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. And after a while, they came to expect it, and I think relish it, because there would be a contest of ideas. Because my office never accepted what DFAT served up without questioning. And I found, in my time as a minister, that the more you challenged your department, the better they responded and the more effort that they put into it. And I used to have this framework in my mind in Cabinet as to how I would deal with a proposal from the public servants. And it was based on a framework that the brilliant Thomas Sowell, an economist philosopher at Stanford, had. And he said, before you make a decision on an issue, ask yourself 3 questions. Compared to what? So the public service are giving you a decision to make. Well, what else could we do? Are there other options? Robo-debt might be a case in point. Compared to what? What else could we do to achieve this outcome? Secondly, at what cost? And I don't just mean at what financial cost, although you'd be surprised the number of times public service didn't provide the actual cost, but at what cost? And not just financial, but personal, reputational, political. Who is winning? Who is losing? At what cost? Thirdly, what's the evidence? What's the hard evidence you're relying upon that gives you some sense of comfort or certainty that you'll get the outcome you're seeking? And if there is no evidence in the brief, or the public service can't come up with the evidence, then you're taking a risk, but make sure it's a calculated risk. By the end of my time, I added a 4th question, with the greatest respect to Professor Sowell, and that was, what could possibly go wrong? And I found that to be the most useful question I could ask in Cabinet. So I can't give you any more information about robo-debt other than what's obviously been available in the public arena. But a fiercely independent public service that is used to being challenged, in fact relishes being challenged, is what Australians should be demanding and should expect.
Thank you.
Did you have another question in there?
Well, robo-debt, risks...
No, you had one in between Barbie and robo-debt.
Barbie, being a woman in politics.
Oh, being a woman.
Yes.
Well, I always used to say, well, I've never been a man in politics, so I can only answer to what it's like for me. Yeah. I achieved all that I wanted to achieve in politics. It would be churlish of me to say that there was a glass ceiling. I became the Minister for Foreign Affairs, which is without doubt the best job in politics. Thank you.
Ben Packham.
Hi, Ms Bishop. Good to see you again.
Great to see you.
The Productivity Commission says Chinese trade bans on Australian exports had virtually no impact. Do you think then that we should be so quick to re-engage with China when they've given us such a kickstart on diversification? And do you think Anthony Albanese should visit Beijing before the bulk of those trade bans are resolved and the detained Australians are released?
I did see that Productivity Commission report, and I wasn't surprised by it because anecdotally I've spoken to, for example, winemakers across Australia, and they felt an absolute death blow in the beginning, but then they appreciated that they had put all their eggs in one basket because they were able to get bulk exports into China and good prices. It forced them to diversify and find new markets, maybe not the same amount, maybe not at the same prices, but they were forced to diversify, and they have. And that's good trade policy. That's good export policy. So you're right, we now have a kickstart in diversification. But that was always good trade policy, which is why I recall we used to pursue free trade agreements, bilateral free trade agreements, plurilateral free trade agreements if we couldn't get a multilateral free trade agreement, because Australia is an open, export-oriented market economy. We rely on fair access to markets around the world for our standard of living, for our economic growth. So Australia should continue to diversify, but that doesn't mean we should ignore the fact that China is a significant purchaser of our commodities and continues to be so, whether it be iron ore or natural gas or lithium and the like. Look, China is a challenging partner. you could be a full-time foreign minister working on just China issues. But we want to be friends with everyone around the world. A country of our size, an open liberal democracy, an open export-oriented economy, we need to be part of the global economy, and China is a significant part of that economy. We're also in the same part of the world, the Indo-Pacific, so we want good relations with all nations in the Indo-Pacific. Where we disagree, we should speak out, but we should manage our disagreements. And I would encourage Prime Minister Albanese to take the opportunity, if invited, to visit Beijing. He has to be invited first, you don't just turn up. So if he is invited, I would certainly take that opportunity, and I think Foreign Minister Wang Yi would be instrumental in ensuring that such an invitation were extended.
We shouldn't wait until those issues are resolved, though.
Well, I don't think he'll be invited until those issues are resolved, so it's a bit of a chicken and egg.
I think he has been officially invited.
Well, I would, I would, on that basis, I would go and raise these issues while I was there. I didn't think there was a date.
No, there's
no. That's what I thought. There's no date.
The question is whether it will be this year or next year, for example. Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, I would accept the invitation. I would attend graciously, but the trade barriers and the outstanding thawing of relations would be top of my agenda.
Julie, normally this event runs till about 1:35. We're about there now. Are you okay to take another couple of questions?
Sure.
Oh, terrific.
Sure.
Natassia Chrysanthos.
Thanks. I'm Natassia Chrysanthos from the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. I wanted to ask you about bribery allegations surrounding Australia's offshore detention system in Nauru and Papua New Guinea that have been published by the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age this week. Wanted to know what you've made of the allegations and whether you think they should be subject to an independent investigation that probes the involvement of both Labor and coalition governments.
I'm afraid I know nothing more about it than what I read in summaries, and having been on a plane for the last 36 hours, I haven't given it much detailed thought. But if there are credible allegations of bribery, then of course that's a criminal offence in Australia and ought to be investigated if there are such credible allegations.
Do you think it should be, hypothetically, by a corruption watchdog or just the AFP, for example?
Well, hypothetically, as I don't know the nature of the allegations, it would depend on what they were and what entity was available. It could be federal police, it could be any number, but I'm not aware of the specific details. But if there are allegations of bribery from a credible source, of course they should be investigated. Thanks.
Don't you miss coming to the press club and being Tim Shaw.
Thank you, Mark. Je m'appelle Tim Shaw. Merci beaucoup for your speech.
I have no idea what you just said.
Oh, of course. Kevin Rudd is the Ambassador to the United States. Stephen
Yes.
Smith's our High Commissioner. Alexander Downer, one of the longest-serving foreign ministers, and he served in London. Former foreign ministers make great diplomats. Have you been asked to consider, whilst you are busy as Chancellor of the ANU, have you been asked to consider to serve as a diplomat? You and Penny Wong had a collegiate relationship most of the time, except for
No,
some
we still do.
Have you been asked?
Well, that would be a matter between me and whomever was doing the asking. But I can assure you that I am more than delighted with my role at the Australian National University as Chancellor.
But you won't rule out serving our nation as a diplomat?
Tim, we don't play the rule in, rule out game. You know that. We don't play that game anymore. I am more than happy living in Australia, but I do pay credit to Stephen Smith and Kevin Rudd and any other former Foreign Minister or Prime Minister who thinks it's a good idea to pick foreign ministers up from the airport on a regular basis.
Merci beaucoup.
It can be a humbling job, I guess. Bloomberg's Ben Westcott.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for your speech. You were Foreign Minister during a period of incredible complexity in the China relationship. It was during the beginning of the rise of Xi Jinping, and some of the language you've used here today is things like de-escalation and referring to China as a force for global good. I'm sure anyone who was paying attention to foreign affairs around the time that you were Foreign Minister would feel quite a wave of nostalgia for that sort of period of time. It was very different from the language used by the Morrison government, and it's sort of come back towards what you were using under the Albanese government. Do you think that there could have been more subtlety in the way that the Morrison administration handled Australia's relationship with China?
There's nothing more frustrating than ex-foreign ministers giving current foreign ministers advice on how they should handle bilateral relationships. But the relationship with China is complex. It can be difficult to manage. I developed a particular rapport with Minister Wang Yi and worked very hard to maintain an open, collaborative connection. It wasn't always easy, and it did change significantly from Hu Jintao, who was there in 2013 when I first became Foreign Minister, and then Xi Jinping in 2014. And then over time, China became much more adversarial, much more aggressive in its foreign policy, and I could see that in the diplomats. And so it meant that you had to change tempo. Things were handled perhaps differently. But it did escalate after my time as Foreign Minister. Now, I'm not privy to all the reasons why, and like every political issue, there are layers and layers of complexity that we can't begin to fathom. But I find that Australia is at its most effective when we have the ear of many nations. And the reason we're so well regarded in foreign circles and on the international stage, and I can vouch for that, Australia's voice is respected and is heeded. People want to know what we think, is because we're reasonable and we're logical, and we are usually rather objective about the positions that we put forward, always highly conscious of the fact that we must act in Australia's national interest. But there are ways and means of doing it, and I think diplomacy, particularly soft power diplomacy, is underdone in this country through successive governments, and I would like to see, here's a plug, is anyone from DFAT here? I would like to see much greater focus on our diplomatic efforts, because as former Defence Secretary Jim Mattis said, a former Defence Secretary of the US, he would like to see more effort in diplomacy because military conflict is very costly.
Thank you.
Indeed it is. We're going to try and scoot through 3 quick questions.
So you'd like me to be more concise in my answers?
Or perhaps the questions. Georgia Roberts from the ABC. No? Have I got that wrong? Test economy, sorry, yes.
Thank you very much. I might pull that down a little bit. I'm a little bit shorter. Thank you very much for your time today. As a Foreign Minister, what are your thoughts on how Australia has managed its relationships in the region within the context of increased competition?
You mean the competition between the United States and China?
I do.
I think Foreign Minister Penny Wong is doing a very good job managing our relationships in the region, as has Prime Minister Albanese. The focus on ASEAN and the visits to Pacific Island nations have all been very important in showing Australia's willingness to be a partner with other nations in our region. And that was always a theme that I sought to promote, particularly in relation to the Pacific. It wasn't an aid donor, aid recipient relationship, but it was economic partners working together to lift Pacific nations into a state of prosperity and security. So I think that the Albanese government has done a good job in that regard. In terms of managing the US-China tensions, I've addressed that. I think Australia has a continuing role to play, and I think both Foreign Minister Wong and Prime Minister Albanese are capable of adapting to that role, of being a moderating voice if the tensions spill over into anything even close to military conflict over Taiwan. And I believe that they would be joined by virtually every other nation in the region. I can't think of anyone who thinks that conflict over Taiwan is a good idea.
Thank you. Georgia Roberts from the ABC this time. Sorry about that before.
That's okay. Georgia Roberts from the ABC. So key Liberal Party donor John Majerison has told a parliamentary committee he was due to appear before that he has severed all ties with Australia. You know Majerison. Are you comfortable the Liberal Party was accepting donations from someone who appears to have been acting in good faith?
Do I know this person?
You've been in several photos with him, so...
Honey, I get stopped at airports. People take photos of me all the time. I mean, I could be standing next to the head of a mafia gang and I...
So you don't know John Majerison at all?
I don't know the name, I'm sorry.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
And a final question from Julie Hare from the Financial Review and from the Press Club Board.
Thank you. Julie here from the Australian Financial Review. This time last week, Jason Clare was standing where you are now, releasing the interim report into the university's accord. His big ambition is to double the number of undergraduates by 2050, which is to 55% of young people, while digging deep into equity groups. I would just like your thoughts on whether you think that's achievable, and given ANU has made a very clear decision to remain small, it's much smaller than all its G08 competitors, what that would mean for your institution.
Yes, I applaud the fact that Minister Jason Clare delivered an accord as a former education minister, but only for a little time. The higher education sector is in constant need of review and support and reform. And I think that the accord was a very good idea, and there are a number of ideas put forward. On the question of the size of universities, it's very much a decision for individual universities as to who they are, the profile they want, the type of students they want, the type of student experience they wish to provide. And ANU has made a conscious decision to be of a particular size. We're 20,000 students. We have 8,000 foreign students from around the world. It's like a mini United Nations at ANU campus. We have 6,000 students living on campus. So we have I would say, the highest concentration of students living on campus. So we have that student experience that students rate as number one amongst the group of 8. So we've made a decision about the kind of university we want to be, the kind of academics we want to attract, and the research and education and training that we want to provide. Other universities will make different choices, and we've certainly seen some universities go for scale. And no doubt they will be able to support Mr Clare's aspirations to increase the number of undergraduate places, as long as the government is prepared to back them, because a university degree is a very expensive initiative, and no university can do it alone. It needs the federal government to support it, and if Minister Clare wants to expand the number of places, well then obviously the federal government will have to support them. I'm delighted with ANU's decision to be the national university that attracts the best and brightest from across Australia and around the world. And the size puts us, rankings-wise, amongst Princeton, Yale, Caltech, below the University of Melbourne, but it's company I'm more than happy to keep.
Thank you so much.
Would you please thank Julie Bishop?